The ink was the color of frozen river water. Eleanor Vance held the heavy silver pen between fingers that did not tremble. She did not look at the man standing 3 paces from her, though she could feel the heat of his irritation, a heavy, suffocating weight in the immense quiet of the great hall. "Sign it, Eleanor," Arthur said. His voice was flat, a controlled baritone that had spent generations learning how to dismiss human things without altering its cadence. "We have reached the end of what this arrangement can bear. The estate requires stability. It requires a presence that the county respects." Above them, on the first landing of the grand marble staircase, a small, sharp sound broke the stillness. A diamond-encrusted heel tapped once against the balustrade. Lady Beatrice stood beneath the cold glare of the crystal chandelier, her crimson silk gown pooling around her ankles like spilled wine. She adjusted the heavy diamond choker at her throat, her bright green eyes crinkling with a small, triumphant amusement. "Do let her take her time, Arthur," Beatrice said, her voice carrying down to the stone floor with the practiced lightness of a woman who had never known a room that did not belong to her. A woman from her background must find the legal wording rather dense. It is not quite the same as totaling the linen expense or arguing with the coal merchants, is it? Eleanor did not lift her eyes. She heard the words the way she heard the rain striking the high leaded windows of Sterling Manor, as a physical fact of the weather, requiring a preparation, not emotion. For 10 years, she had held the accounts of this house in her head. She knew the dry rot in the west wing drainage. She knew the exact weight of grain the tenant farmers submitted before Arthur's cousin began altering the logs. She knew every floorboard that announced a visitor to the library below. She had been 22 when she took the keys. She was 32 now, and the house had become a second skin, a map of invisible labor written in the quiet steel of her spine. She looked down at the parchment, the dissolution of marriage. Beneath it, a clause that stripped her of her name, her position as house steward, and her right to remain within the boundary walls of the Sterling estate. She was to receive a single modest sum, paid quarterly through an anonymous clerk in London on the condition that she never correspond with the tenantry or set foot in the county again. "You have been thorough," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet, a low, smooth alto that lacked the dramatic pitch of the ballroom, but held a strange, expensive stillness that made Arthur move his feet. "It is a standard document," Arthur replied, his jaw hardening. He looked away, his pale blue eyes fixing on his own family portrait that hung across the hall. The world changes, Eleanor. A duke cannot manage a legacy of 3 centuries with a steward's daughter at his side. Beatrice brings the London connections. She brings the court interest. It is a matter of administrative necessity. Necessity. Eleanor repeated. She pressed the pen to the paper. Her signature was small, precise, and perfectly legible. She did not use the heavy, decorative loops Arthur favored. Each letter was clean, straight, and final. When she finished, she set the silver pen down beside the inkwell. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she pulled the thin gold band from her left ring finger. The gold had been cheap. The old Lord Krill had bought it for them during their brief private ceremony when Arthur was still a second son with nothing but an empty title and a debt-ridden house to his name. The ring came away with a slight resistance, leaving a deep, pale indentation in the skin of her finger. a white mark against her pale, ivory flesh. She placed the ring on the center of the white parchment. It did not make a sound. Arthur muttered, his hand twitching toward his pocket watch. There is no need for. The house is yours, your grace, she said softly. She turned away from the grand table. At the edge of this, nay, Lellen N, near the heavy oak doors, her old leather suitcase sat on the floor, its straps worn down by years of travel before she had settled here. Beside it, on a small walnut console table, lay a small, thick object. It was her private journal, a leather-bound notebook with a faded red wax seal on the corner of the cover. It looked like an old ledger, the sort of worthless scrap an uneducated woman might leave behind when her trunks were searched. Beatrice watched from the stairs, her chin tilted up. Leave the rubbish, girl. The maids will have the hearth cleared by morning anyway. Eleanor looked at the leather-bound notebook for 3 seconds. She did not touch it. She turned her face toward the door. The heavy iron bolts groaned as the footman withdrew them. Outside, the March rain was falling in dark, relentless sheets, blurring the ancient elms that lined the driveway. The air that rushed into the hall was bitter and smelled of wet earth and dead leaves. Eleanor Vance picked up her suitcase. Her Douve gray wool dress was thin, but her spine was perfectly straight. She walked across the threshold with looking back at the portrait or the man or the woman who had taken her seat. Behind her, the iron gate of the manor house swung shut with a heavy, final clang, locking her out in the dark. The rain was not a sudden storm, but a quiet, freezing persistence. It soaked through the thin wool of Eleanor's Dove gray dress before it crossed half the length of the gravel drive. The cold bit into her skin, sharp and absolute, but she did not quicken her pace. She carried the old leather suitcase in her right hand. In her left, she carried nothing, leaving her fingers exposed to the chill. The pale, deep indentation where her wedding ring had rested for a decade felt strangely light, burning slightly as the freezing rain hit the bare skin. The suitcase was light. It possessed the specific, hollow weight of a life that had been systematically erased. She knew exactly how little it held because only 2 hours earlier, she had stood in the center of the master suite and stared at the empty canvas lining. That room had been hers for 10 years. It was a vast, drafty chamber with heavy velvet drapes and a massive mahogany bed. A room she had kept meticulously organized. But when Beatrice had arrived that afternoon, the disruption had been immediate. Eleanor's modest silver brushes had been swept from the vanity to make room for Beatrice's crystal perfume bottles. Her practical woolen shawls had been shoved into a corner to accommodate a staggering array of silk gowns. Standing before the open suitcase in the fading afternoon light, Eleanor had reached her private breaking point. It had not arrived with tears. She had learned long ago that tears were a currency Arthur did not respect, and Beatrice would only mock. The breaking point arrived instead as a profound, terrible stillness. It was the visceral realization that her entire adult life, every ledger balanced late into the night, every frozen winter she had spent negotiating with merchants to keep the estate afloat, every silent sacrifice she had made to protect Arthur's fragile pride amounted to a single sheet of parchment and a dismissal. Through the thick oak floorboards of the bedroom, she had heard the distinct, lovely notes of a string quartet. Arthur had hired musicians from the village. She had heard the bright, unbothered sound of Beatrice's laughter cutting through the melody, followed by the clink of champagne crystal. They were celebrating. They were toasting to the new heir of Sterling Manor, drinking the wine from the cellar that Eleanor had personally inventoried and preserved. She had stood in the quiet of the bedroom, her hands resting on the edge of the empty suitcase, and allowed herself 1 minute to feel the total, crushing weight of the betrayal. Her throat had tightened. Her fingernails had pressed so deeply into the leather binding of the suitcase that her knuckles turned white. She had loved him once. She had believed that duty and loyalty were the foundations of a lasting house. She had been wrong. He did not want a foundation. He wanted a gilded ornament to impress the county. Earth. When the minute passed, the pain in her chest had crystallized into something else, something cold, precise, and entirely unbreakable. Earth. She did not pack the dresses Arthur had purchased for her to wear at formal dinners. She did not take the mall earrings he had given her on their 5th anniversary. She packed 3 practical day dresses, a pair of sturdy boots, and her mother's wooden comb. Then she opened the false bottom of her writing desk. Inside lay 2 objects. The first was her private journal. The leather bound notebook with the faded red wax seal on the corner, like a discarded ledger, worn and unassuming. She picked it up, feeling the thick, hidden layer within its back cover. The second object was a heavy brass key, forged centuries ago, its bow intricately cast with the royal crest of the Sterling bloodline. It was not the key to the front doors, nor the wine cellar, nor the treasury. It was the master key to the deep archives beneath the foundation of the house, a key that old Lord Krill had pressed into her hand on his deathbed, bypassing his own son. The title goes to the boy, the old man had whispered, but the house goes to the one who knows its true name, Das. Eleanor had slipped the heavy brass key into the deep pocket of her dove gray wool dress. Its weight against her hip was a quiet, solid promise. She had taken the leather-bound notebook in her hand downstairs and deliberately, carefully placed it on the walnut console table in the great hall. It was not forgotten rubbish. It was a seed planted in toxic soil. Now, the gravel crunched under her wet boots as she reached the towering wrought iron gates of the estate. Earth. A hired carriage waited on the muddy road, its lantern swinging gently in the wind. Eleanor handed her light suitcase to the driver and stepped up into the dark cabin. Before she pulled the wooden door shut, she paused. She looked back through the iron bars and the driving rain, up the long avenue of elms to the glowing golden windows of Sterling Manor. She did not look at it with the grief of a discarded wife. She looked at it with the cold, measuring gaze of a rightful owner, calculating the cost of an upcoming eviction. She pulled the door shut. The carriage rolled away into the dark. 4 months passed, and the slow rot of Sterling Manor did not announce itself with a crash, but with 1,000 quiet failures. Summer arrived in the county, heavy and humid, but the great house felt entirely unmoored. Lady Beatrice's reign as the Duchess of Sterling was loud, aggressively glamorous, and fundamentally disastrous. She understood the aesthetics of power, but absolutely nothing of its mechanics. Within her first 6 weeks, she dismissed the head gardener because she disliked the smell of earth on his boots, resulting in the swift, catastrophic decline of the heritage rose gardens. By July, she had ordered the heavy velvet drapes in the West Wing replaced with fragile imported silks, blatantly ignoring the dampness in the stone walls, a specific structural flaw Eleanor had meticulously managed with localized coal fires. When the first heavy summer storm hit, the drainage failed exactly as Eleanor had once warned it would. The water seeped through the ancient mortar, ruining a fortune in new fabric overnight. Arthur sat in the grand library, the heavy oak door firmly shut against the shrill sound of Beatrice complaining to her maid in the corridor. He rubbed his temples, feeling a dull, persistent ache that had taken up permanent residence behind his eyes. The grand mahogany desk was drowning in paper. Demands from the coal merchants whom Beatrice had deeply insulted by demanding a line of infinite credit. Angry letters from the Western tenant farmers whose grain yields had been miscalculated, leading to missed payments and threats of broken leases. The silver in the dining room was beginning to tarnish because the specialized polishing schedule Eleanor had designed had been discarded. Every ledger, every receipt, every contract that crossed his desk was a tangled, bleeding mess. Arthur set his pen down and looked across the room. Near the fireplace, positioned perfectly to catch the warmth of the hearth, sat a high-backed leather armchair. It had been Eleanor's chair. For 10 years, she had sat there in the evenings, a quiet, immutable force, her fingers flying columns of numbers, predicting disasters months before they could strike. She had never asked for praise. She had simply held the world steady so he could comfortably stand on top of it. The chair was empty now. Beatrice had refused to sit in it, calling the dark leather depressingly masculine. But she had not bothered to have it removed. It remained in the room, a silent, gaping hole in the architecture of Arthur's life. He was beginning to understand, with a cold, creeping dread, the exact dimensions of what he had thrown away. He had traded the very foundation of his estate for a gilded weather vane. He had wanted a woman who looked good in a ball gown. He had forgotten that a duke's primary duty was not dancing, but surviving. A soft knock at the door interrupted his grim calculations. A young housemaid entered carrying a silver tray. She looked nervous, her eyes darting to the towering stacks of unpaid invoices. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she murmured, dipping into a hurried curtsy. Her Grace, the Duchess, ordered the console table in the great hall completely cleared. "She wishes to display the new imported vases. I found this shoved behind the wainscoting where it must have fallen. I thought it looked like estate business, sir." She stepped forward and placed a single object on the edge of the mahogany desk. Arthur did not immediately look at it. "Thank you. You are dismissed." When the heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving him alone in the suffocating silence of the library, Arthur finally lowered his gaze. Sitting atop a stack of furious letters from the tenantry was a worn, leather-bound notebook. Its edges were frayed from years of handling, and a faded red wax seal sat heavy on its bottom corner. Arthur stared at it. His breath caught shallow and sharp in his chest. He recognized it instantly. It was the book Eleanor had carried with her everywhere. She had never opened it in his presence, and when he had once asked about it, she had calmly replied that it contained nothing but old recipes and minor household tallies not worthy of his attention. He remembered seeing it on the console table the night she left, sitting there like a discarded afterthought. Beatrice had called it rubbish. He had let it be treated as rubbish. The leather binding looked incredibly small on the massive expanse of the Duke's desk. Yet, it seemed to pull all the gravity in the room toward it. Earth, outside the tall library windows, the wind howled through the elms, rattling the loose glass in the frames. The house was suffering. The estate was bleeding. And sitting right in front of him was the only piece of Eleanor Vance left within the boundary walls. Arthur slowly reached out. His aristocratic hands, which had so easily signed away a decade of loyalty, hovered over the worn leather. The silence in the room thickened. Pressing against his eardrums, his fingers brushed the faded red wax seal, feeling the cold, rigid texture of it. He hooked his thumb under the heavy cover, and then, alone in the dark, the Duke opened the book. The pages smelled of dried lavender and old paper, a scent so intrinsically tied to Eleanor that Arthur felt a sudden, phantom tightness in his throat. He opened the leather-bound notebook, expecting to find the mundane scratchings of a steward's daughter, kitchen recipes, perhaps, or notes on mending linens. Instead, he found a masterpiece of survival. It was a shadow ledger. For 10 years, Eleanor had kept a private, immaculate record of the estate's true anatomy. Her handwriting was small, precise, and devoid of the heavy, decorative loops he himself favored. It was the exact same script she had used to sign the dissolution of their marriage. Arthur turned the pages, his pale blue eyes tracking the columns of dark brown ink. He did not scan, he read. And as he read, the cold architecture of his own ignorance rose up to crush him. She had not merely balanced the books. She had performed miracles in the dark. He found entries detailing how she had privately renegotiated the coal contracts, saving the estate from freezing during the devastating winter of his third year as Duke. He found quiet, dispassionate notes indicating where she had used her own meager allowance to repair the western roof, so he would not have to cancel a frivolous, expensive trip to London. She had documented the early subtle manipulations of his cousin in the accounts and had systematically insulated the estate's core funds to protect Arthur's legacy from theft. October 14th, read one entry. Sold the modest pearl earrings to cover the shortfall in the tenant seed fund. Must not know. Earth. His pride regarding the estate's liquidity is fragile. The harvest matters more than the jewelry. Arthur's breath hitched in the dead quiet of the library. He stared at the words. His pride is fragile. She had known him. She had seen right through the rigid military posture, the tailored charcoal coats, and the aristocratic arrogance, straight down to the terrified, inadequate man beneath. And instead of using that knowledge to break him, she had spent a decade quietly holding him together. His hands began to tremble. He dragged his thumb across the thick, rigid back cover of the notebook. The leather there felt unusually stiff. Double bound, perhaps, heavy with the weight of its own construction. He traced the faded red wax seal on the corner, completely unaware that sealed within that very layer of leather rested the legal ruin of his entire bloodline. He was too overwhelmed by the ink to question the binding. The heavy oak door of the library was suddenly thrown open, striking the wall with a violent thud. "Arthur, this is simply intolerable!" Beatrice swept into the room, a vision in an aggressively bright emerald silk dressing gown, her golden curls piled high in an elaborate, trembling mass. She did not look at the towering stacks of unpaid invoices on his desk, nor did she notice the visceral devastation on his face. She only saw an audience. The county is whispering. Beatrice declared, pacing across the Persian rug. She crossed her arms, her diamond rings catching the light of the hearth. I received a letter from Lady Harrington this morning, and the tone was practically pitying. They think we are hiding. They think this dreary, damp house has swallowed us whole. Arthur closed the leather-bound notebook. He rested his hand over the cover, a protective, desperate gesture. We are not hiding, Beatrice. The estate is currently facing a severe liquidity crisis. The Western farms are. I do not care about the Western farms, she snapped, her voice hitting a shrill pitch that vibrated unpleasantly against the books lining the walls. I care about my position. Earth. I am the Duchess of Stirling. I will not sit in this gloomy fortress and be treated like a secondary thought to a woman who wore gray wool and smelled of floor wax. Arthur's jaw tightened. He looked at the empty leather armchair by the fire. He looked at the woman standing before him. What do you want, Beatrice? He asked, his voice entirely hollow.
A grand gala,
she commanded, stopping before his desk and planting her hands on the edge. At the end of the month, I want the ballroom opened, the crystal chandeliers brought down and scrubbed, and the entire county invited. We must show them we have recovered from that drab little woman. I will wear the sterling sapphires, and we will announce my absolute authority over this house. It is a matter of necessity. Necessity. The exact word he had used to justify destroying his marriage. The echo of it made Arthur physically nauseous. He looked down at the frayed leather notebook beneath his palm. He thought of Eleanor walking out into the freezing rain with an empty suitcase, leaving behind a house she had bled for, while the woman in front of him demanded a party, while the foundation rotted beneath her feet. Very well, Arthur said softly, staring at the faded red wax seal. Send the invitations. We will have the gala. He did not yet understand that he was building the very stage upon which he would be destroyed. The chambers of Abernathy and Cole in the heart of London smelled of expensive cigar, smoke, floor wax, and centuries of quiet, devastating secrets. Eleanor sat in a high-backed leather chair that was a near-perfect replica of the one she had left behind in the library of Stirling Manor. But she did not sit on the edge of the cushion as a steward reporting to her employer. She sat entirely back, her posture perfectly aligned, wrapped in a sharply tailored charcoal gray day suit that possessed the quiet, expensive authority of a woman who no longer needed to hide her intelligence behind dove gray wool. Across the sprawling mahogany desk, Miss Tessunker, Abernathy, an elite solicitor who managed the invisible architecture of England's oldest families, stared at the object Eleanor had just placed on the polished wood. It was the heavy brass key with the royal crest. I have practiced law for 40 years. Miss Vance, Abernathy said softly, folding his hands, and I have waited for that key to appear on my desk for the last 10 of them. Old Lord Krill told me on his deathbed that he had given it to the true anchor of the estate. He gave it to me. Eleanor said, her voice smooth and devoid of any tremor, along with the truth of my grandmother's lineage. Abernathy nodded, pulling a sealed, dust-covered file from his desk drawer. The county believes you were a steward's daughter, elevated by an act of charity. They do not know that your grandmother was the legitimate older sister of the late Duke's father, a woman erased from the family tapestry because she married for love rather than political convenience. By the strict laws of succession, established in the original royal charter, the bloodline, and the absolute ownership of the properties runs through your vein, not Arthur's. Eleanor looked out the rain-streaked window of the London office. She thought of Arthur's rigid arrogance, his obsession with the word necessity, his desperate need to prove his worth through a woman who wore diamonds instead of a woman who held the foundation together. Old Lord Krill knew Arthur was unfit to manage the legacy. Abernathy continued, breaking the heavy seal on the file. He married the two of you to bring the true bloodline back into the house without a public scandal, but he left a failsafe, a legal codicil stating that should Arthur ever dissolve the marriage and break the bond, the estate would revert immediately and irreversibly to the rightful heir. Eleanor slowly drew off her dark leather glove. She looked at her left hand. The pale, deep indentation of the cheap gold wedding band was still visible on her ring finger. It no longer burned. It no longer felt like a wound inflicted by a cruel man. It felt instead like a receipt of purchase. She had paid for this estate with 10 years of silence, labor, and flawless management. The trust is ready to be unlocked, Abernathy said, his tone shifting to pure legal precision. I have drafted the injunctions. I have the eviction notices prepared for both His Grace and Lady Beatrice. However, there's one critical missing element. Eleanor met his gaze. The original will.
Yes.
Abernathy said, leaning forward. My files only hold the secondary confirmation. To execute the absolute transfer of power and freeze Arthur's assets, I must present the original signed document bearing the late Duke's seal. Without it, Arthur could tie this up in the courts for a decade. Do you know where your father-in-law hid it?
He didn't hide it,
Eleanor said. He gave it to me. Abernathy blinked, losing his professional composure for a fraction of a second. You have it?
No,
Eleanor said calmly. I carried it with me every day for 10 years. It is bound within the false back cover of my private ledger. The leather was doubled and sealed with red wax. I kept it disguised as a simple household notebook. Miss Vance. Abernathy said, the blood draining from his face. If Arthur discovers that document, he won't. Eleanor interrupted, her tone dropping the temperature in the room. Arthur does not look at things he considers beneath his station. He only sees what flatters him. But where is it? It is sitting exactly where I left it, Eleanor said, on the console table in the great hall, or perhaps moved to his library by a maid. It has been sitting inside his house, under his nose, for 4 months like a ticking clock. Abernathy stared at her. He saw the cold, untouchable elegance in her deep gray eyes and realized he was not speaking to a discarded wife. He was speaking to a predator who had spent a decade studying her prey. He is throwing a grand gala next week, Eleanor said, rising smoothly from the leather chair. A public celebration to announce his new wife's absolute authority over the county. Every prominent family, every investor, every rival will be standing in the ballroom. She picked up the heavy brass key and slipped it into her pocket. Draft the final papers, Mr. Abernathy. I require you to accompany me back to the county. It is time I attended a party. The ballroom of Stirling Manor was a masterpiece of forced celebration. Hundreds of candles blazed in the massive crystal chandeliers overhead, casting a fractured, brilliant light over the county's elite. The room was a sea of shifting colors, of tailored evening coats and heavy silk, moving to the upbeat, frantic tempo of a hired string quartet. At the center of it all stood Lady Beatrice. She wore a crimson silk gown that demanded the attention of the room, the heavy fabric pooling around her like freshly spilled blood. The sterling diamond choker glittered tightly around her throat, a blinding declaration of her victory. She laughed loudly at a joke made by a visiting baron, tilting her head to ensure the diamonds caught the light, thoroughly convinced she had conquered the county. She had not. To the untrained eye, it was a triumph, but the quiet, ancient families of the county did not have untrained eyes. They noticed that the ballroom was distinctly drafty, a biting chill seeping through the improperly sealed terrace doors. They noticed that the champagne being poured was from the wrong vintage, a sweeter, cheaper stock that Eleanor would never have allowed out of the cellars for a formal toast. They smiled at Beatrice, drank the Duke's wine, and whispered behind their fans about the profound, undeniable deterioration of the estate. Standing by the grand stone fireplace, Arthur, the Duke of Stirling, felt as though he were suffocating. He wore his formal charcoal coat, the brass buttons polished to a mirror shine, but his posture was rigid, locked in a state of tense misery. He did not taste the champagne in his glass. The noise of the ballroom, the shrill pitch of his new wife's laughter, the clinking of crystal, it all grated against his nerves like broken glass. His mind was not in the ballroom. It was upstairs in the dark, quiet library where a frayed, leather-bound notebook sat on the center of his mahogany desk. For a week, he had done nothing but read and reread its pages in the dead of night, measuring the colossal scale of Eleanor's silent sacrifices against the absolute ruin of his current reality. He was a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own design, watching the walls slowly rust. Then the music faltered. It did not end cleanly. The lead violinist missed a note, dragging his bow across the strings with a harsh, discordant squeak. One by one, the other musicians stopped playing. The sudden, heavy silence rippled outward from the orchestra pit, washing over the crowded ballroom until the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the low howl of the wind outside. The towering oak double doors at the entrance of the ballroom had been opened. Arthur turned his head. His breath stopped entirely. Eleanor Vance stood on the threshold. She did not look like the exhausted, quiet steward who had walked out into the freezing rain 4 months ago. She was framed by the grand archway, dressed in a perfectly tailored midnight blue velvet gown. The fabric was heavy and immaculate, absorbing the light of the chandeliers rather than reflecting it, giving her an aura of dark, untouchable gravity. Her dark brown hair was swept up in a severe, elegant twist, exposing the long, pale line of her neck. She wore no jewelry. She did not need to. Her presence alone possessed an expensive, devastating stillness that commanded the absolute obedience of the room. The crowd parted automatically, stepping back to create a wide, clear path down the center of the polished floor. No one whispered. No one moved. They simply stared at the woman who had returned, recognizing instantly that she was not standing there as a discarded wife. She was standing there with the cold, assessing gaze of a predator, observing a trap she had set herself. Arthur's hands went numb. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble hearth with a sharp crash. He didn't flinch. He could not look away from her. Beatrice, however, turned violently at the sound of the breaking glass, her eyes snapping toward the doors. The triumphant smile vanished from her doll-like face, replaced instantly by a flush of ugly, unfiltered rage. What is the meaning of this? Beatrice snapped, her voice breaking the silence with a shrill, unpleasant echo. She lifted her chin, her hands knotting in the crimson silk of her gown, as she marched forward, placing herself directly in the center of the room. Eleanor began to walk. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. How dare you show your face here? Beatrice demanded, her voice rising in pitch as she pointed a trembling ring, heavy finger at the doors.
You have no right to step foot on this property!
You are a dismissed servant, a forgotten mistake.
Guards, have this woman thrown out immediately!
Eleanor did not stop. She did not break eye contact with Beatrice, nor did she acknowledge the furious command. Her face remained a mask of flawless, terrifying calm. When she was 10 paces away, Eleanor finally paused. She looked at Beatrice, then at Arthur, who was standing frozen by the fireplace, looking entirely hollowed out. I am not here to attend your party, Beatrice, Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet, but in the absolute silence of the ballroom, it carried with the cutting weight of a steel blade. I am here to conclude my audit. Before Beatrice could open her mouth to scream another insult, Eleanor simply raised her left hand, the hand still bearing the faint, pale indentation of a missing gold ring. With a flick of her gloved wrist, the shadows behind her moved. Abernathy, dressed in a severe black suit, stepped through the grand doors and stood squarely at her right side. In his hand, he carried a thick, locking leather briefcase embossed with the seal of the Central High Courts. You bring a solicitor to my gala? Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh, looking around the room for support. Earth. Ere we to be subjected to a lawsuit over unpaid wages in the middle of a celebration? Arthur, have your guards remove this pathetic woman and her clerk. Arthur did not call for the guards. He did not move. He was staring at Mrs. Abernathy, his face draining of color, while Beatrice saw only an old man in a black suit. The older, quiet families of the county saw something entirely different. A low, electric murmur rippled through the gathered elite earth. Abernathy and Cole was not a firm that handled unpaid wages. They handled the invisible architecture of the highest nobility. They drafted treaties, concealed royal indiscretions, and dissolved empires. When a senior partner of Abernathy and Cole walked into a room, someone was about to lose everything. Abernathy ignored Beatrice completely. He set his heavy leather briefcase on a nearby marble table and unfastened the brass locks with 2 loud, echoing clicks. Your Grace, Abernathy said, his voice a perfectly modulated instrument of legal authority, addressing Arthur. I am here executing the final directives of the late Lord Krill, Duke of Stirling. My father is dead, Arthur said, his voice hollow. His will was executed a decade ago. The public will was executed. Abernathy corrected smoothly. It granted you the title of Duke and the administrative rights to this estate contingent upon one specific, unbreakable condition. A condition you violated 4 months ago when you signed a dissolution of marriage. Beatrice stepped forward, her face flushing and ugly, mottled red.
His marriage to that servant means nothing! I am the Duchess of Stirling!
Abernathy turned his head just a fraction of an inch to look at her. Madam, you are a trespasser. You possess no title, no legal standing, and no rights within these walls. He looked back at Arthur, who was visibly trembling now. Miss Eleanor Vance is not a steward's daughter. She is the direct descendant of your father's older sister, the legitimate holder of the primary bloodline. Your father did not arrange your marriage to give her charity. He arranged it to give you a home. The estate has always belonged to her. The silence in the ballroom deepened, shifting from mere shock to a suffocating atmospheric pressure. The county's elite stood perfectly still, their eyes darting between the magnificent, untouchable woman in the midnight blue velvet gown and the crumbling duke by the fireplace. The injunctions freezing your assets have already been filed. Abernathy continued, extracting a thick sheaf of legal parchment from his briefcase. The only remaining requirement to finalize the absolute transfer of Sterling Manor to its rightful owner is the presentation of the original codicil bearing your father's seal. Abernathy paused, fixing his sharp gaze on Arthur. I believe, so you have it in your possession. Arthur's breath hitched. He looked at Eleanor. She stood 10 paces away, her dark eyes looking right through him. She was not gloating. She was simply waiting for the inevitable mathematics of his downfall to compute. Slowly, like a man moving underwater, Arthur reached a shaking hand into the deep inner pocket of his tailored charcoal coat. Earth. He had carried it with him all evening, unable to leave it in the library. Tethered to the gilt written on its pages, he pulled out the frayed, leather-bound notebook. Beatrice stared at it, her jaw dropping. The rubbish. You kept her rubbish. Break the binding, Arthur, Eleanor said. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him since she entered the room. Her voice was not a request. It was an execution order. Arthur gripped the thick-back cover of the notebook. With a sickening crack of old glue and stiff leather, he tore the false backing open. The faded red wax seal snapped in two. From the hidden hollow of the leather binding, a folded piece of heavy, cream-colored vellum slid out and fell into Arthur's hand. The massive dark red whack crest of old Lord Cruel pressed heavily onto the parchment. Arthur unfolded it. His eyes tracked the few devastating lines of text. Earth. The paper trembled so violently in his hands it produced a dry, rattling sound in the quiet room. Read the final line, Your Grace. Abernathy instructed mildly. Arthur's lips parted. He had to swallow twice before his voice worked. In the event of separation, he read, his tone entirely stripped of its aristocratic cadence. The entirety of the Sterling lands, holdings, and manor shall revert irrevocably to the true heir. Eleanor Vance. Beatrice let out a sound that was half shriek, half sob. It's a forgery!
It's a lie! She is a peasant!
She lunged toward Arthur, clawing at the parchment, her heavy diamond choker flashing aggressively in the candlelight.
Burn it! Burn it right now!
Arthur did not burn it. Earth. He stepped away from her, letting his arm drop, his eyes fixed hopelessly on Eleanor. The social hierarchy of the room corrected itself with brutal efficiency. The visiting baron, who had been laughing with Beatrice 10 minutes earlier, quietly took 2 steps away from her. The rest of the elite crowd followed, a silent, coordinated retreat. Within seconds, Beatrice and Arthur were left completely isolated in a wide circle of empty, polished floor. The crimson silk of Beatrice's gown no longer looked like power. It looked like a warning flag. Eleanor stood in the center of the room, wrapped in midnight blue and cold authority. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand an apology. She simply watched the men and women who had whispered about her for a decade bow their heads in complete, absolute silence. The music did not resume. The guests did not say their goodbyes. They departed with the swift, coordinated silence of people escaping a sinking ship. Within 10 minutes. The grand ballroom of Sterling Manor, which had been staged to celebrate the rise of the new Duchess, was entirely empty, save for 3 people and a solicitor. Earth. The heavy oak doors stood open to the drafty corridor. Beatrice was weeping. It was not a delicate, aristocratic crying, but a harsh, ugly sound of sheer panic. She had collapsed onto a velvet settee, clutching the crimson silk of her gown, realizing that the diamonds around her neck belonged to an estate she no longer had any right to inhabit. Arthur did not look at her. He stood in the center of the vast, polished floor, staring at the piece of vellum that had fallen from his trembling hands. He slowly lifted his gaze to Eleanor. The midnight blue velvet of her gown seemed to absorb the light of the crystal chandeliers, rendering her completely untouchable. She was the woman he had dismissed as a drab, unnecessary fixture, the woman he had sent out into the freezing rain with an empty suitcase. He took a step toward her. His military posture was completely gone, his shoulders bowed under the crushing weight of his own profound stupidity. Eleanor, Arthur whispered. The words sounded like ash in his throat. I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know about the lineage. I know you didn't, Eleanor said. Her voice was perfectly calm, devoid of any cruelty or heat, because you never bothered to look past your own pride to ask why my grandmother's portrait was locked in the East Wing. You saw what was convenient for you to see, a quiet girl who could balance your books and absorb your temper. I made a catastrophic mistake, Arthur said, his voice breaking. He closed the distance between them, stopping just short of reaching out to touch her, deterred by the absolute ice in her dark, gray eyes. I was blinded by the pressure of the county, by the expectation of what a duke should have. I threw away the only real thing in this house, please. Eleanor, give me the chance to make it right. We can tear up the dissolution. We can restore the marriage. Eleanor looked at him. She did not feel the sharp, twisting pain she had felt in the bedroom 4 months ago. She did not feel anger. She felt the specific, weightless piece of a ledger that had finally balanced to 0. There is no marriage to restore, Arthur, she said softly. I gave you 10 years of absolute loyalty. I kept your secrets. I managed your debts. And I protected your legacy. And in return, you gave me a piece of parchment and an empty suitcase in the rain. Our accounts are entirely settled. She raised her left hand. The pale indentation of the cheap gold ring was still there, but it no longer looked like the brand of a discarded wife. It looked like a scar earned in a war. She had thoroughly won. Abernathy, Eleanor said, without taking her eyes off Arthur. Yes, madam. The solicitor replied, stepping forward. Have the carriage brought around to the front steps, Earth. His Grace and his companion will be leaving immediately. They may take whatever personal clothing they arrived with, nothing else. Beatrice let out a fresh sob, burying her face in her hands. Arthur stood perfectly still, the last remnants of his aristocratic pride crumbling to dust. He realized in that devastating moment that begging would not save him. The woman before him was not a victim seeking revenge. She was the owner of the house, and she was simply taking out the trash. Earth. Eleanor turned her back on them. She did not wait to watch them weep, and she did not stay to watch them leave. She walked out of the ballroom, her footsteps echoing sharply against the stone floors. She walked down the long, quiet corridor, past the grand staircase, and opened the heavy oak door to the library. The room was dark, save for the low, glowing embers in the hearth. The towering stacks of unpaid invoices and panicked letters still cluttered the mahogany desk. But they no longer looked like a threat. They looked like work. And Eleanor had never been afraid of work. She walked across the Persian rug toward the fireplace. She reached into the deep pocket of her velvet gown and drew out the heavy brass key with the royal crest. She set it gently on the mantelpiece, the metal gleaming in the firelight. Then Eleanor Vance turned and looked at the high, backed leather armchair by the fire. It had sat empty for 4 months. It had waited for its true master. She walked over to it, smoothed her hand over the worn, familiar leather, and sat down. She leaned her head back, closing her eyes as the quiet, ancient heart of Sterling Manor beat steadily around her. The storm was over. The house was hers.